Dr. Hamilton died of an acute angina attack at about 1:45 p.m. April 7, 1935. It was a Sunday afternoon. On April 12, 1935, Margaret wrote a letter to her husband, who had stayed back in Ontario when Margaret came out for her father's funeral. It said, in part, "I must tell you of the wonderful sitting I had with Harold and Jack out at the Allisons last night. It was a lovely group of Dad's oldest friends. We met in the library, where Dad and all of us have had so many happy hours chewing the fat with Dr. Allison. Hence the atmosphere was very conducive to Dad's coming. Harold went into trance at once and took on his control David, who told us of Dad's passing. David described it as being one of the easiest, the most beautiful he had ever been privileged to witness. He said Dad knew what was happening and just took a deep breath, closed his eyes on this world, and opened them on the next. Isn't that a lovely thought? I was so happy to hear this because it would have been so horrible if Dad had suffered." Well, the point of all this is, David said the very first thing Dad did was to meet Walter and come back here to see what the seance room looked like from the other side. Isn't that like Dad? A most amazing and interesting thing happened Sunday afternoon. While Mother was lying on Dad's bed waiting for Glenn to phone back from the hospital, this was between 2 p.m. and 2:30 p.m., she suddenly heard voices coming through the amplifier, which Jim had turned on. She said her heart just thumped because she knew the voices meant something. She glanced at the clock, 2:20 p.m., but at that time she had not been told Dad had passed over. He did at 1:45 p.m. So she got up and tried the seance room door to make sure it was locked, as it was, of course. She couldn't make out what the voices said, but she could distinguish that there were two, and they sounded very eager, and they continued to be heard for 3 or 4 minutes. Isn't that simply amazing? And it fits in with what David, through Harold, told us last night about Daddy and Walter hiking over here, and Walter showing Pop all his apparatus, including the voice machine, and Dad asking all sorts of pertinent questions. Another point is this, that only Mother and Jim knew of these voices, and she didn't tell me about hearing them Sunday afternoon until last night, after I told her all about our wonderful sitting. 5 days later, at a seance at the Hamilton home on April 17, 1935, the group had sung "Unto the Hills" and barely started the sitting when Mercedes exclaimed, "Here is the doctor." She passed into trance and Dr. Hamilton controlled her. "You carry on," he said. "I'm watching you. Don't move that chair," he continued as he placed his vacant chair back into the circle. "It's nothing at all, just like in the bedroom and you here, just like in another room. I can see you, and it's just as I told you by all the controls, just as I told you. There is nothing strange." Mrs. Elizabeth Poole had stopped attending 2 years earlier for health reasons. She died a few months after Dr. Hamilton's death. Mercedes, one of their great auxiliary mediums, died in January 1941 following a stroke. Soon messages began appearing by automatic writing from Dr. Hamilton through Mary Marshall, who was the only medium still alive from the old days of 1927, now almost 14 years later. Dr. Hamilton wrote many messages from the other side, a few of which are remarked here. He said in November 1943, "Many persons here sink into a sort of subjective bliss which makes them indifferent to what is going on upon the earth. This is a great place in which to grow if one really wishes to grow, though few people take advantage of its possibilities. I want to tell you of a large organization of souls who call themselves the teachers. Their special work is to take hold of those who have just come over, helping them find themselves and adjust themselves to the new conditions. There are many women in this organization, and they do good work. January 1944. When I first came here, I was so interested in what I saw that I did not question much as to the manner of seeing. But since being with a teacher and helping in these writings, I have begun to notice a difference between the objects that at a superficial glance seem to have much the same substance. I can see a difference between those things which have existed on earth unquestionably, such as the forms of men and women, and those things which, while visible and seemingly palpable, may be and probably are thought creations. This thought came to me while looking on at the changing light I told you of the heavenly country, and it has been forced upon me with greater power while making new explorations, that I may be able to distinguish at a glance between these classes of seeming objects. For example, if I met the famous characters in Treasure Island, I would have reason to believe that I had seen a thought form of sufficient vitality to stand as a quasi-entity in this world of tenuous matter. So far I have not encountered any such characters. T.G.'s reference to characters from Stevenson's Treasure Island is strikingly evidential, for it was through his prolonged and painstaking study of the Poole trance visions, in which he saw John Silver and other characters from that book as apparently living beings, that Dr. Hamilton came to hold the opinion that suggestion by the communicator probably accounted for the greater bulk of visions, symbolical settings, and so on, that crowd the pages of psychical and occult literature. He believed that this imagination of the living dead, backed by strong will, produced many of the puzzling phenomena in this area of mental activity. As had been suggested by the poet Blake and later Walt Whitman, imagination may indeed actually be a powerful creative force, and probably evidenced more directly in the new state than here on earth. March 1944. A few weeks later. Lillian, I want to tell you about a different kind of people in whom I have been interested. They are people who, when on the earth plane, denied the immortality of the soul. My teacher tells me that thousands upon thousands of them have been asleep for generations. I feel that this is a chance for me to try to awaken some of them. They have not been wicked. I wish I could describe these souls to you. A little later he continued, As I told you, I was expecting to begin a new work among a group of people who, when on the earth, denied the immortality of the soul. Many of them have been asleep for centuries, perhaps ages. When I rejoined my teacher, I asked him if he had ever tried to awaken one of these sleepers. He made no answer for a time, and then he said that he had, but that he had failed. He told me that one had to go through various stages before one had enough power for this purpose. It was very hard to believe that one has to go through all the other stages of progression before one can accomplish such in this connection. But he came back again and continued, Lillian, I regret that I am not strong enough yet to recall one of these sleeping ones. However, I have seen one who has been called back by one of the higher teachers, and I realize as never before the personal power of these teachers. What he said I cannot repeat at this time, but after repeated commands the man stood up. But I could see that his efforts were almost too much for him. My teacher tells me that I must learn more about the one whom I desire to awaken, for after he is awakened I must teach him from the first. Many have been brought out of this sleep when they come out from under the spell which they have worked upon themselves.